Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to check in on a couple of my worm bins right here in front of us. These European Nightcrawler systems have now been in service 156 days, fed 14 times. So today, after 13 days since the last check-in, we're gearing up to give them feeding number 15. So I'm going to slip on a glove and get these systems up on the bench. Let's get to work. So we're just going to pull off these plastic covers to reveal the material in the containers, and the first thing you see is a coffee filter. So this semicircular shaped piece of paper is a coffee filter, which is really serving the function of feeding zone indicator. It's really holding up quite nicely, but we don't need to hang on to these since I've got replacements. In addition to some of the kitchen scraps that we're going to be feeding these little guys today, I've also got a couple days worth of coffee, which includes the coffee filters. So what we're going to do with these coffee filters is we're going to set them aside briefly, and when it comes time to reset the feeding zone in each of these systems, these pieces of paper can simply go in as supplemental bedding material to go in alongside the feedings that the systems are being given today. So I've got an assortment of different types of frozen veggies and fruits and whatnot, and it's down here beneath all the foods that you can see the coffee filters with those couple days worth of coffee sitting in them. So now the stuff they got last time was in large part tomatoes from my garden, and we were that's interesting. Here's a little corn cob bit. Once in a while I'll take corn cob and I'll slice it into little discs like this to try to help its breakdown process. So corn cob is just one of those things that is really slow to break down in the worm bins, and that's the reason I sometimes try different things to see if I can help it along. In the case of that little piece of leftover corn cob there, I had cut the corn cob up into little discs. So now the novelty item in these systems is cotton, because just like kitchen scraps and leaves and other things that you can put into your worm bins, another thing that a lot of people don't know about composting is that natural fibers such as wool or silk or cotton can also all be placed into the worm bins to be composted. So we took a couple t-shirts 111 days ago and we dropped them into here. And even as recently as the last check-in 13 days ago, we were still seeing, I think over here in bin number 1, little tiny bits of remaining fabric attached to some of these threads. We're already starting to see some of the t-shirt here in cotton number 1, although at this point it would be hard to identify it as a t-shirt unless you're a seamstress or something and you knew what this stuff that we're seeing here represents. Basically what we're seeing is the stitching, the threads that were used to assemble the t-shirt from the various fabric panels. And it does seem like they're all in one way or another attached to each other. So the really easy part of it to identify is the neck, because the tag that goes around that is attached to the threads that go around the neck is right there. And then as you work your way down the shoulders to the sleeves and so on and so forth, you start to encounter more and more of the thread that's holding the t-shirt together. And of all the material that the t-shirt is made up of, this is the only stuff that the worms are unable to break down because it's not a organic material. This is going to be some sort of a synthetic polyester or some sort of a thread, which the worms can simply not eat. However, they do really get in there, right in between all the threads that they're unable to eat. They nibble away all the fabric that they can eat, leaving behind pretty much nothing of the t-shirt, unless you count this as something, but It's almost gone. And if you really want to be a stickler, you might actually consider some of what we're seeing here as a little bit of fabric, possibly still jammed in between some of these synthetic threads that has not yet been nibbled away clean by the wormies. That would be my guess as to what we're seeing here, where we can't really see through the individual strands and threads. So in a way, if you wanted to be really technical, you could probably say that despite the fact that these t-shirts have been in these systems for 111 days, that at least here in bin number 1 we're still seeing leftovers. I didn't really go to that extent when we were in bin number 2 last time to try to spot leftovers. I had this funny feeling that in bin number 2 perhaps all the fabric had already been consumed. I saw nothing that resembled leftover patches of cotton fabric. So I kind of wrote off bin number 2 and the t-shirt that had been placed into bin number 2 as being a done deal, but I sort of treated the entire test as both t-shirts needing to be gone. So obviously not a very scientifically conducted test. Every time I see a slightly larger piece of material, though, I question whether or not it might be a bit of leftover cotton fabric. Because here and there I thought there had been certain patches of material that broke free from the threads and were still floating around within the bins. But last time too, we just had no luck locating any of that stuff. So my guess was that that stuff actually did get broken down even prior to the last check-in 13 days ago. And I don't know, at this point, do we really count those little tiny patches of material that still seems to be stuck in between the threads over here in bin number 1 as material that still needs to be consumed by the worms before we can consider this test as complete? It doesn't matter to me. I mean, I'm happy to continue the test for one more round and see where we get to before we can see really no signs of any cotton fabric remaining. So perhaps if you want to be a real stickler, you know, you can say, hey, it's not gone until it's gone. So maybe that is the case here. So some people might just be of the thinking that says, hey, you know, for all intensive purposes, those little wormies have done a number on that t-shirt, and what remains, if you really want to count that as leftovers, is so minuscule it's not worth counting. But either way, I think just for fun, if for no other reason than just for fun, I think we will simply treat that as a technicality and a reason to continue. So maybe even after 111 days, even though I thought that perhaps today might be the day that this test might come to a conclusion, we might still even have enough material left in here to justify the continuation of this test up until the next check-in. And it would be kind of difficult to expect or believe that we should expect to find more or any leftover cotton remaining by the time we get in here next time. I mean, it's such a tiny, tiny little bit. I mean, if I didn't look really closely, then I probably wouldn't have even seen it, but I really did sort of go out of my way to sort of go up and down each strand of thread and see if I can spot leftovers. Here we've got a lot of worms kind of hanging out on the fabric, so I think we'll just rest it out here in the light, give the worms a chance to kind of react to the light and leave, and then we'll have a better look at how the fabric is, well, how the thread is holding up. If there's any fabric remaining in it, remains to be seen. Like I said, I think last time I kind of came to the conclusion that it was gone already, but I might not have looked closely enough. Over here in bin number 2, we might be in the same situation as bin number 1, that there might be a little tiny bit of material remaining to be whittled away by the wormies on those synthetic threads. So I think we're ready to just continue on to feeding these little guys. So let's just excavate a little bit more down into this feeding zone and give ourselves a little bit more space to pile in today's feeding. It's kind of funny, during the last check-in I kept pushing some of this kind of gooey, sort of almost creamy kind of material aside, because it was obviously something that the worms were very interested in. They were all over this stuff. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it was. The entire check-in, I was just staring at this stuff, questioning over and over, you know, what it was. And it was only after I concluded the check-in with these systems and I got back to my computer and reviewed the previous feeding that I realized that what I had placed in here, that the worms were responding so much to was a whole bunch of ground up walnut, and there's still a lot of it sitting in here as leftovers, despite the fact that it was placed in here 2 feedings ago, and despite the fact that the worms clearly seem to really enjoy this stuff. But they've somehow managed to, you know, leave enough of it as leftovers here that that it continues. And we can't really say that it's all gone because I'm definitely seeing leftovers of it. So I've got my prepared bedding. I think I can probably go over there and grab some of it. Last time I don't remember if we used my prepared bedding. I'm pretty sure what we used last time as bedding is what we're doing here today. Very similar to what we're doing here today, is just some soiled napkins that need to be composted and done away with. So I think last time we may have simply dropped in a couple little pieces of paper, which is what we might be seeing some leftovers of here. I definitely see some leftover bits of stuff that looks like possibly paper. Every time I encounter something that looks like that, I do attempt to tear it, because if it was still cotton fabric, I suspect that it would not tear readily. So I'm pretty sure that those larger, lighter colored objects that we encounter here and there are simply scraps of leftover paper that would have been placed in here fairly intact, and just large chunks, which the worms will definitely get to over time, you know. But before we pile in their foods, my prepared bedding is here. It's in this little box, so why don't we just grab some of it. As you can see, I've got plenty that we could use. I just replenished the supply, so we can certainly spare a nice little handful or so of fresh bedding for these little guys. Last time, when I reviewed the video from last time, I could see that we were still encountering pockets of material in these systems of just almost untouched leaves, you know. When we start up the outer edges of these systems, we kept bumping into pockets of leaves that looked like they might not have even hardly been touched by the worms. So I, you know, before we forget, let's bring in these old coffee filters that had been our feeding zone indicators. Right there, I think we're going to have ourselves a nice little platform onto which we can set up our feeding. It almost does seem to me like we're probably going to find a whole bunch of leftover bedding material, just based on the way we put so much of it in here without any food yet. So we got paper down there, we got paper, you know, napkins and paper towels or whatever those were, stacked up with some of my prepared bedding, shredded cardboard, leafy mix. And these veggies definitely have a lot of frost collecting on them. There must have been a good bit of moisture content to them, which I guess started making its way out of the fruits and veggies and freezing as ice crystals. So I'm trying to be fair here. The lettuce seems like a thing that the worms are going to enjoy. I want to make sure a piece of lemon ends up in each system. I see carrot peels here, but we've, for the most part, depleted all the fruits and veggies. What remains is some coffee. But before we put the coffee in, I think this would be a good place to maybe throw in some of the leftovers we encountered, some corn cob bits, some chunks of this pulverized walnut we encountered along the way. Get all that stuff back down into the feeding area where all the fun's going to be happening, where there's the highest likelihood of worm traffic and potential for getting broken down. And then onto all this delicious stuff, on top of which we're still even going to pile in the coffee and some of my worm chow. We'll put in the fabric. So I mean, one thing we wanted to do though here, right, in bin number 2 was to sort of inspect these threads to see if these might also show signs of maybe a little bit of possibly cotton stuck in between some of the polyester threads. And I do feel like I'm seeing a little bit of that right over here. Definitely not much. I mean, we didn't see much of it over here in bin number 1 either, but it does definitely strike me as leftovers. Something tells me that if we come back in here next time and we see the same thing, then perhaps what we're seeing there is not even leftover cotton. Perhaps it is just some other material that the worms are simply not going to be able to break down. And perhaps today, at 111 days, perhaps today is the day we should have identified as the end of the test. But we'll see, you know. We can always sort of make that determination next time we come back in here. If we still see some more of that stuff, then we can kind of write that off as probably never getting broken down in the worm bin. And then we could treat today as possibly having been the day that we observed no more cotton leftovers of the t-shirts. But I think for fun, we'll just go one more round and then decide next time when we get back in here. At which point it would be hard to believe that we're going to find any leftovers, but who knows? You never know. Especially if we've got all that stuff nestled right in between all the delicious food scraps, and then on top of that we've piled the coffee, which I've now sprinkled with a little bit of my grit. The grit here is pulverized eggshell that I add to some of my feedings, but this other stuff that I'm going to sprinkle on top of that is worm chow. It's mainly pulverized pumpkin seed, and in addition to pumpkin seed, another main ingredient of this batch of worm chow is these kind of noodles that are made out of vegetable matter rather than being made out of grains or flour or, you know, typical noodles. So let's get these feeding areas covered up. This will be our excuse to sort of bring in some material from the outer edges to see what we see. When we did this during the last check-in 13 days ago, we did encounter a whole bunch of leafy matter, but we did do a pretty good job blending it in, if you ask me. We attempted to get that stuff scattered throughout the surrounding material so that it wouldn't just sit there as a big pocket. Some of the leftovers that we're seeing of it are still visible here, like the leaf stems. So even though the leaves, for the most part, have been gobbled up, the stems themselves will take a little bit longer before the worms can really polish that stuff off. And, you know, at 156 days of age, I suppose if we wanted to, we could probably still continue supplying these worms with leafy types of bedding with even more stems in them if we wanted to, because I think we're still going to be, you know, running these bins for a period of time into the future that would give all those little leaf stems a chance to break down. But then again, we could always just opt to use my prepared bedding, the shredded paper and cardboard mix, which actually does have leafy matter blended into it as well, but it's all leafy matter that I've run through a screen and did my best to try to you know, remove all the leaf stems from. So even though once in a while my prepared bedding that does have leaves in it also includes a little bit of leaf stem material, it's very small bits, very thin bits that sort of sneak through the screening process, but I definitely make a best effort to exclude that stuff in the interest of having a prepared bedding that has the capability of breaking down pretty quickly once it's introduced into the systems versus having ingredients that are going to take a long time before they can break down. So it is kind of nice to see that the stirring up of the material last time did result in us freeing those little pockets of leaves from each other so that they're not little jumbles, although I think I just encountered a little pocket where there were still a couple leaves sort of holding out, stuck to each other, protecting one another from being approached by worms. In fact, they were even a little bit dry. So every time I bump into little pockets of material that seems to have been kind of jumbled together and ended up as a mound that the worms are not really able to approach and work down for us, I do like to try to break that stuff up and blend it in with the surrounding materials. Otherwise the stuff will just sit there for a very long time before it is able to sort of soak in moisture from the surrounding materials and become comfortable enough that the worms can approach it and make their way into it. So I guess because of the fact that we did encounter quite a bit of that stuff last time, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any of it. And that little tiny bit that we encountered there that we just got done blending in over in bin number 2 was almost hardly even worth worrying about. It pretty much tells us that the blending of all those pockets of dry leaves that we encountered last time have pretty much all been incorporated into all the surrounding materials, exposing all of it to worm traffic and the breakdown process. So I think we've got ourselves a nice setup here. Nice generous portion of bedding applied beneath the feeding, and any other residual bits of bedding that had been out here in the systems has been kind of blended in and incorporated into the bedding to make it easy for worms to come by and snag this stuff. So I think that brings us to the conclusion of today's check-in with the European night crawlers. I guess almost on a technicality, still continuing with the breakdown of the fabric, that with those little tiny bits of cotton fabric that I believe we found. And I guess if next time we come back in here and it looks unchanged, then perhaps we will just write that stuff off as possibly not being cotton, and then we can treat this as a test that did actually end today. I'd be curious to see if anybody has any input in the comments about this. Perhaps they know a little bit more about the way fabric and threads and sewing and t-shirts are manufactured. Maybe what we saw there was in fact just some, synthetic material, and then maybe we can actually write this test off as complete. So please let me know, leave a comment. All right, everyone, that's it for the check-in today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.